Hello and welcome to this episode of the Politics of Nuclear Nonproliferation. My name is Alison and I'm joined by my colleague Damjan. In this edition, we will tackle the ins and outs of China's nuclear weapons program and why it has seen an unprecedented expansion in the past couple of years. We will be addressing the main questions and concerns plaguing experts. For example, why has the state decided to ramp up its nuclear production right now? Is this in response to the recent tensions with the United States, or is it the regional hostilities which are driving China's armament? How far will the state go with this project, and exactly how concerned should we be? Stay tuned to find out.
Thank you, Alison, for that introduction. Over the past couple of years, China has been massively ramping up its nuclear capabilities. Existing weapons have been modernized, and plenty of new ones are being built as we speak. In addition, supporting infrastructure, such as silos and aircraft, is being constructed to match this accumulation of weapons. If this continues, it is estimated that China will more than double its existing nuclear arsenal in a decade's time. To give you an exact idea of the growth we're talking about, the Pentagon released a report towards the end of last year, which estimates that China will have around 1,500 warheads by 2035. This is in stark contrast to some 200 which it had only 2 years ago. In the world of nuclear weapons, this is a truly dizzying rise.
Such a development is worrying, but it is equally puzzling. Compared to the two biggest nuclear powers, the United States and Russia, China has maintained quite a peaceful nuclear stance since the inception of its program in the 1950s. The leaders have pledged to never use their most potent weapon first, and never against a non-nuclear armed state. In addition, China professed a minimum deterrent strategy, aiming to build an arsenal just big enough to dissuade any potential attacks, but not big enough to allow for belligerent posturing. This official policy remains unchanged today, despite the recent armament efforts. Why then is China accumulating nuclear weapons at such a breakneck speed? To learn more, my colleague Damjan and I will have the honor to speak with Matt Korda, a prominent expert on China's nuclear policy. Matt is a senior research associate and project manager for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists in Washington, D.C. Together with a colleague, Matt actually uncovered the construction of numerous nuclear silos in northwestern China. He has a lot of valuable and interesting knowledge and insight to share. We can't wait to meet him and pick his brain.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting. However, before we meet Matt, let's conduct a brief overview of the history. So, China started developing its nuclear program in the mid-1950s, as Alison said, aided by the Soviet Union. The initial goal was to strengthen the country's negotiating position on the world stage. You see, back then, Mao Zedong did not view nuclear weapons as crucial to winning a potential war with one of the two hegemons of the Cold War. He believed that conventional weaponry would make the difference. Therefore, nuclear weapons would only serve as leverage in negotiations and as a deterrent. The efforts to develop a nuclear program were successful, and China conducted its first test in 1964. In doing so, it became the fifth state to acquire nuclear weapons, after the US, the USSR, the UK, and France. Subsequently, these five superpowers would form the so-called nuclear weapons states, as recognized under the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. Incidentally, these five are also the sole members of the UN Security Council, which attests to the significance these weapons carry on the global stage. Over the course of the following years, China's arsenal slowly grew. Precise numbers were impossible to come by, as the Communist Party wasn't willing to reveal the full scope of its program, but most experts estimated it to be between 100 and 200 warheads, putting China behind the four other UN Security Council members.
In line with its pledge from 60 years ago, China maintains its official policy of no first use and overall non-use against states without nuclear weapons. Just recently, in 2019, China released a white paper declaring that it does not engage in any nuclear arms race with any other country and keeps its nuclear capabilities at the minimum level required for national security. Unsurprisingly, this has raised quite a few eyebrows among experts, especially in other nuclear weapon states. If China still only wants to assure its survival, that could mean that it now sees the danger from other nuclear weapon states as significantly greater than just a few years ago. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. After all, it is precisely for such quandaries that we have reached out to Matt.
In response to concerns about its unprecedented nuclear expansion, China asserts that the policy is unchanged and that the stockpiling of nuclear weapons is part of a modernization process. And yes, it is true that China has been modernizing and diversifying its arsenal continuously in the past, but it was nowhere near this scale. What particularly concerns experts is the fact that this process involves all three of the country's nuclear arms branches: land, sea, and air. The land-based missile force is benefiting, in addition to hundreds of new warheads, from numerous silos being built in the deserts of the Xinjiang province. Excuse any potential mispronunciation. These structures serve to store the ballistic missiles and shield them from potential strikes, and of course to launch them. Furthermore, China is ramping up its production of intercontinental ballistic missiles, building more efficient and further-reaching ones. And in addition, China recently introduced 2 state-of-the-art ballistic missile submarines to its fleet, bringing the total to 6. Finally, the Air Force is expected to obtain highly capable nuclear bomber planes in the near future.
Yes, Damjan, that really does leave a crater in the argument that the armament is only part of regular modernization efforts, if you'll excuse the pun. As for the reason for these worrying developments, most experts look for them in current tensions in China's backyard. There is no denying that recently China's relations with both its neighbors and the US have overall taken a turn for the worse. The ongoing Taiwan crisis is doubtless the most publicized case, and the fact that it heavily involves the interests of the United States justifies China's weariness. Couple this with the frosting of US-China relations since 2018 and their well-known trade war, and suddenly China's apprehensiveness of the world's leading military becomes understandable. Additionally, regional tensions have also been escalating. Most notably, China's border disputes with India have led to minor skirmishes, a symptom of the deteriorating relations between the world's 2 most populous countries. We mustn't forget that India also possesses a nuclear arsenal and it is not party to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, potentially making it less susceptible to the norms around which the global nuclear order has worked for the past 50-something years. Finally, North Korea seems to be getting ever more erratic and belligerent, having conducted no fewer than 9 nuclear tests in 2022 alone.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but if the prospect of the world's most enigmatic and the least predictable state brandishing its nuclear weapons doesn't make you want to shore up your defenses, nothing will. And throw in the deterioration of relations between the world's strongest army and the most populous nation, both nuclear powers incidentally, and China's actions start becoming more understandable and nuanced.
Indeed, but that's enough from us now. Let's hear what Matt Korda has to say. Computer, okay. Okay, thank you very much. All right, very good.
So this means that we can start.
Yes.
And first of all, we would like you to tell us a bit about yourself, your research, exactly what does it look like?
Sure.
What are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, so I guess I don't know where to start. So my name is Matt Korda. I'm a senior research associate for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. And I'm also an associate researcher at SIPRI in the Weapons of Mass Destruction program. And so basically the goal of our work, kind of just broadly, is to analyze nuclear trends amongst all of the 9 nuclear armed countries, and to see sort of, what those countries are building, what they're up to. We use open sources to do those things. And so we use things like satellite imagery, treaty documentation, government statements, social media, all of that stuff to kind of put together a coherent picture of what's going on in the world of nuclear weapons for each of those countries. And the goal is to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit on nuclear secrecy, nuclear opacity, and try and inject factual information into the public debate. So that's kind of the in broad strokes what we do.
Yes, thank you for telling us.
Yeah, very nice.
So if I may ask the first question, and we are wondering, to what extent would you say China is true to its state policy of no first use? Would you say that this policy was at least partly formulated out of necessity due to China's previous technological inferiority to the US and Russia?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I would say that I guess despite the pretty significant changes in China's external security environment, as well as just like its own status on the world stage and its technological capabilities, those kinds of things, its approach to nuclear strategy and force posture has been relatively consistent for many decades, at least up until quite recently. So, and I guess we'll talk about that in a bit, I suppose. And so, you know, in contrast to countries like the United States, you know, perhaps some could say about Russia as well, which has sort of viewed and deployed nuclear weapons in a way that could be considered more akin to almost a warfighting posture. China's political leadership has traditionally viewed nuclear weapons in this, you know, almost exclusively as sort of tools for deterring other countries from using nuclear weapons against China. And so, given that that goal can be accomplished with a relatively small number of nuclear weapons, China has maintained for many decades what it calls, you know, a minimum nuclear deterrent, or you know, or a similar formulation. And so today, sort of the estimation of that is that, you know, there's that leads to about a few hundred warheads compared to several thousand that are deployed with the United States and Russia, and the vast majority of those are housed in central storage. And how this relates to the no first use posture question is because in recent years, what the United States has been claiming is that China is sort of adjusting its posture in a way, and that it's implementing what I guess a launch on warning posture. And the Pentagon says that this is called, you know, some framing of like early warning counterstrike is sort of how is the framing of how they're calling it. And I guess the idea behind that is that like the warning of an impending missile strike means that China could potentially launch nuclear weapons, which could potentially constitute first use in the event of a crisis or something like that, or a false alarm or a miscalculation. And the U.S. has said that China's deployed, you know, some radars and satellites to support that posture. So if that's true, then it would mean that China is beginning to sort of mirror the posture that the United States and Russia have had for many decades. And, you know, that being said, China has sort of publicly rejected that posture. They've said it you know, we don't do that. It would be incompatible with our no first use posture, which they've, you know, has been going on for many years. But then you have the U.S. officials also questioning China's no first use posture. Right? They've said that, I think it was if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was the previous commander of Stratcom said that you could like drive a truck through the no first use policy. But then he sort of walked that back because it, you know, it's a bit of an overstatement perhaps. But you know, the recent report that the United States put out about China and included questions about its no first use posture, it said that China is sort of probably including some consideration of a nuclear strike in response to non-nuclear attacks. And that's possible. We don't really know. And I guess the thing that I would sort of note is that what China is doing with regards to its nuclear modernization is quite a dramatic expansion, but the expansion itself does not necessarily indicate that any changes to the no first use posture are taking place, right? Like it's certainly possible that those things are connected, but one could also put forward a plausible explanation that says, you know, China's building all of these silos and all these things because it just wants to maintain a completely survivable deterrent. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the no first use posture has to change, but it also could, right? So like we'll sort of have to see how things develop. But that's sort of a very long route to answer your question. I hope that's okay.
Of course. But we would like to hear your personal opinion as an expert. Do you personally think that China's nuclear stance policy could be a bit more aggressive in the near future now that they're stronger, so to speak, in that regard?
It's a great question. You know, I guess like this is really the big debate that's happening right now, right? Is are these big changes to the modernization program, are the big changes to the arsenal, do they portend a dramatic posture shift in one way or another? Or is it just the exact same posture, right, of this kind of minimum deterrent, maintaining the minimum number of nuclear weapons it needs for retaliatory survivability, and it just so happens now that they've made a new assessment that says, the 350-ish warheads we had before is no longer enough. Now we need like several thousand. And I honestly don't know. I wish I had a better response. I can certainly understand arguments on both sides there. Certainly, like, it seems to me that this does follow a pattern, right? That pretty much every nuclear armed state says that they have the lowest number of nuclear weapons that they need for their own security. And I think it's just that because of a variety of factors and how the arms race, and everyone's competing with each other, and everyone's responding to each other's technological developments, that everyone sort of keeps moving their goalposts, right? So like, we only needed this many weapons for our security, but then like 5 years later, they're like, actually, we need all these other ones. So I would say it's like relatively consistent for China to be doing this, because it's kind of what every nuclear armed state does. So it makes sense to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely think so. So to follow up, how much would you say that the, let's call it rapid armament, giving what China is doing now with goals by 2030 to reach a certain number, is due to legitimate fears about their nuclear inferiority? And how much is it due to their domestic politics and a sense of prestige as it rises for hegemony globally? Or maybe a combination of both?
Yeah. I think the prestige factor is really significant and definitely shouldn't be overlooked, right? Like, I think that certainly there's an element in there of responding to developments that the United States is doing, right? Developments that India is making, right? China now has to posture itself against multiple different countries. At the same time, I think the prestige factor is really important, and the role of domestic politics in how countries go about prosecuting their nuclear policy, I think is really important. And we see that not just in China, but in the United States, Russia, France, like basically every country, right? There's a huge domestic and prestige element to all of these countries. And so I guess, like, when we think about the reasons why China is pursuing this kind of, like, as you say, this like rapid armament, I'd say that you can probably like lump things into a few different factors. And I'd say it's probably a combination of all of them in some way. So I mentioned there's like this kind of multilateral security factor, right? China has to posture against the United States. It also has to posture against Russia and India, especially India. Like there's a lot going on right now between China and India. And so there's sort of this like multipolarity going on here that perhaps they've assessed that a smaller nuclear arsenal doesn't work in the context of all of these different countries. Additionally, all of those countries, for the most part, are all making pretty significant improvements to their conventional deterrence capabilities, like conventional precision strike and missile defense. And so, those capabilities are still like many years, I think, away from real maturity. But at this stage, China's probably thinking, they're projecting out into the future and saying, we could have several countries who are able to potentially negate, our nuclear deterrent through missile defense or some combination of conventional counterforce precision strike. And so in that sense, like, I would say, whether or not you believe that that's true or not, I would say that those are probably real fears that they are feeling. And so that is probably contributing to that in some way. Another factor is also this kind of like technological logistic factor, which I think is important too. Like there is some element here, especially when we think about like all the new silos, right? Which is, I think, where a lot of this big new armament is being kind of focused right now. You know, silos aren't necessarily new for China, but this amount of them is very new, right? They've had like, you know, a dozen here or there before, right? But now we're talking about like, you know, over 300, right? This is really big. But previously they've focused all of their efforts mostly on mobile missiles, right? Which I think have been really useful for their posture. But there are problems associated with mobile missiles, right? They're harder to maintain. They're a bit of a slower reaction time in a crisis, right? Silos are a little bit quicker. You also run into a lot of problems with silos, right? They're a lot more vulnerable. But perhaps China has come to the conclusion that having this kind of mix of the two allows them to kind of get the best of both worlds. So perhaps that's a factor in there. And then I think also like the last thing I'd point to, and just to reiterate, like the prestige factor is really important, right? Like the, you know, big nuclear powers like the US and Russia have big silo fields, right? It's this, perhaps it's seen as like this big symbol of being a serious nuclear great power, and maybe China wants to demonstrate that it, you know, can play with those two big countries. And if it really intends to operationalize all of those silos, then it will have more missile silos than Russia, right? It would approach the number that the United States has, right? So like you know, these are like really big developments, and I would say it's probably some combination of like all of these things, but yeah, they're definitely all, I would say, important factors.
Well, it's very interesting that you should mention the regional actors, because that's something I wanted to ask you as well, and we'll get back to that later. But for the moment, I would like to linger a bit on the prestige factor. We obviously know that Chinese society is very much honor-oriented, right? But also they had this 19th century period where they were conquered by the British, and it's a great source of shame for them. So we were thinking, how much do you think that they want to like develop? How many nuclear warheads do you think they want to have? Do you think they want to reach 1,000, 2,000? Do you think they want to have parity with the US and Russia? Do you think they want to overtake them? What is your opinion?
And at some point, the amount of weapons, you know, the flatline effect, you know, once you reach a certain number, what is more going to do? Do you think it's like how to reconcile maybe these types of questions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, right? I think trying to project into the future and seeing, you know, how far they're going to go before they stop. I would say that, you know, like I see what the US projections are. Oh, sorry. I have automatic lights. Hold on, I'll go. All right. Don't mind me. So yeah, so I would say that, you know, just looking at the US projections, right? They project 1,000 warheads, you know, if they maintain the same pace, right? Maybe 1,000 warheads by 2030, and then 1,500 by 2035 is I think what they've said. There's some assumptions that go into that, right? There's assumptions about the number of warheads that China will deploy on each of their missiles, right? If they want to deploy more warheads per missile, then you know, then it requires more warheads in your arsenal. There's also assumptions about fissile material stockpiles, right? So certainly, like, they have enough to build a lot of warheads, but perhaps building up, you know, past a certain threshold would mean that they would have to divert some amount of kind of civilian energy production over to military, which they could do, right? That's certainly a possibility if they chose to do so, if they felt it was a priority. And so, you know, I guess it's a question of like, I guess the U.S. government is suggesting that that those things are probably likely, right? That they will probably do some diversion at some point, or they'll start to prioritize more warhead production over energy, things like that. And I would say that generally, like, those assumptions make sense to me. You know, this big warhead jump, like, I would say it makes sense. I can see the logic behind behind the US saying that China is likely to build up to 1,000 warheads. That being said, I'm not sure if they, like, personally, like, I don't see the utility in going to a much larger stockpile than they have even now. I understand from like their own domestic and political reasons why they want to build up. But I would say that there's still probably a dominant thread in Chinese deterrence thinking that still says we still want the minimum number. I think it's probably those goalposts have shifted. But I would doubt, I'd be surprised if they like went for parity, you know, because I just don't think it's necessary. I think it would be a big, in my opinion, like a big waste of resources on things that they could use for a number of other priorities. And I would say probably that line of thinking still resonates pretty strongly within Chinese deterrence culture, because that's what it's been for decades, right? It's always been like, we're not going to have more than, you know, a relatively small number so that we can spend our resources and time and energy on all these other more important priorities. And so I think probably that they'll still stick to that. So I would guess that like after they finish these silo fields and do, you know, their modernization with their submarines and bring the aircraft online, like I'm not really sure what more there is to do. So I think that like maybe caps them out at roughly the projections that the US is making. But I guess we'll see.
I see.
Still very early at this stage.
Well, I would personally suggest that it has also a lot to do with the way China wants to portray itself to the world. So maybe you're right. Maybe they won't go for parity, but maybe they'll stop it 500 and try to frame it as them being less adversarial and less belligerent than the States and Russia. So they could find a way to frame it. They were also wondering, why are they doing it now? Do you think it's only because now they can, because now they have the technical capabilities, or are there some foreign policy objectives as well? And how do you think it would tie into the question of Taiwan?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So I would say I guess a few things kind of come to mind. So you know, these decisions are probably taken, you know, many years in advance. They only started the actual construction quite recently, right? They've managed to construct you know, the kind of beginnings of these silo fields like incredibly fast, which is really impressive, you know, one way or another. But the decision to do this, you know, was probably taken, you know, substantially earlier would be my assumption here. My guess is probably like it's hard to put a firm date on it or anything like that, but probably you know, looking around, right, just thinking about where the US has been going with its nuclear posture, where it's been going with its missile defenses, seeing that the United States is very unlikely to kind of put any limitations on its missile defenses, and seeing that it evolve into this kind of open-ended project and open-ended architecture that just keeps expanding and expanding. It's probably incredibly worrying for China at the very least. Thinking about how the US has been building, you know, these conventional precision strike capabilities for many years now, and is starting to really get quite advanced with them. And then seeing, you know, tensions rise with India and other countries. Like I would say probably like they saw the writing on the wall and decided that it made sense to start building up. And perhaps there's also like a domestic factor that we're just not as aware of as well. Like there's probably a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes and power brokering and jockeying between, you know, between President Xi and military officials and things like that, sort of behind the scenes that are harder to understand from our standpoint. But perhaps there's some stuff behind the scenes where, like, you know, that spurred a particular decision as well. And so, yeah, like I don't know. There's certainly like all the rational things that you can point to, but also a lot of the time, like nuclear policy decisions are taken for completely irrational reasons. Like as we see, you know, this happens in the US and Russia and like in every country all the time where like they decide to build, you know, a particular system, not because it has any utility, not because the military even wants it, you know, it's just because like there's a domestic reason, or like it'll give jobs to someone in that particular state, or it will please a congressperson, or you know, there's all sorts of like little reasons, or like their polling is down and they need to bring it up, right? So like there's so many reasons why these things could happen. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But we're also wondering, to what extent would you say that the tension between the USA and China that rose up during the Trump administration had anything to do with it? And on the same note, would you say that Biden's administrations, like their less adversarial stance towards China, would maybe attenuate this? Maybe China would be less inclined to proliferate now that Biden's in charge.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like I would say the belligerent rhetoric it's likely to be somewhat of a factor, but perhaps not as strong of a factor as some of those others that I mentioned previously. Like I think countries look really closely at what other countries are doing and not necessarily what they're saying, because I think that, you know, China is probably very aware of the fact that what most US politicians say is motivated almost entirely by domestic politics and not foreign policy. Like there's like some aspect of foreign policy that goes into it, but you know, the US public does not vote based on foreign policy. They vote based on largely domestic policy, and also like based kind of on just like vibes. So it's like there is sort of an element of like needing to just project a like tough image, and it won't necessarily match, you know, the actual like behind the scenes actions, because like no one's paying attention to those in the public domain. But like, so you can be belligerent, you can be cooperative, you can like say whatever you want, and my guess is probably China knows like, okay, like all of that doesn't matter. Like what's actually going on behind the scenes. And so I would guess that like the sort of relative continuity between Trump and Biden in terms of their actions, even though the rhetoric is, as you say, is quite different. But in terms of actions, like I think there has been an element of continuity of like just kind of general hawkishness towards China. I think that will continue regardless of who the president is for the near-term future. So I would expect that China will probably be unlikely to slow down its armament efforts, regardless of what the rhetoric is, even if the rhetoric improves. Because I think there are other reasons why they're doing this, right? It's about survivability, it's about prestige, it's about domestic politics, like it's about all those other things we already talked about. So like, I think they're thinking about those and probably not paying too much attention to like what the signals are from the United States, just in terms of like the statements, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But we also want to look at the Chinese leadership. And since Xi Jinping came to power instead of Hu Jintao, who was a lot less, we shall say, open and friendly, so to speak, towards the West, maybe that could be a factor as well. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably likely, right? The as you mentioned, like the previous Chinese leadership was pretty active in terms of cooperating with the United States, especially on non-proliferation, right? Like that was like really a big deal for China during those years. And you know, they were engaged in efforts like the JCPOA, nuclear security summits, like things like that, more on a non-proliferation level, but still there was engagement there. I'd say that contrasts pretty sharply with current leadership, which is, you know, quite different in terms of how, you know, in terms of the political situation in China, but also how it kind of considers itself within the broader geopolitical context. That being said, it was also a pretty different political situation in the United States as well. you know, when we think about previous Chinese leadership, like that was also at a time, you know, during, you know, Obama administration and things like that. So like the political window for cooperation was much wider back then than it is now. And now I would say both within China, like because of the Chinese leadership, but also because of the US leadership and like the way that the US domestic politics has shifted so dramatically against China. I would say that window has really kind of closed off now, because you sort of get this competition between, you know, the two major political parties in the United States, where they're both kind of like falling over each other to prove who's tougher on China. So, you know, even and that was, you know, there were threads of that still during the Obama administration, but it was very different. Like it was nothing like what it is now. So yeah, I would say the political situation has changed definitely in both countries.
Yeah, for the worst, sadly.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. And how have the other nuclear powers been responding, you know, to China's horizontal proliferation? Has there been anything maybe kind of under the radar that would indicate that there's some type of opinion or fear about it, or we're just watching it and monitoring it and letting it happen? I know the US has a close eye on it.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, it's kind of hard to say like what the other countries are doing and thinking about that. They all have quite different relationships with China than the United States does. I would imagine that probably everyone is similarly concerned about the warhead buildup. Is just sort of my assumption there. And probably there's some thinking both within the United States, but in other countries as well, about how to address that, right? Maybe through some kind of negotiation, or through maybe arms control or something like that. I think that's going to be pretty challenging, probably for a few reasons, right? So like China has never engaged in any kind of arms control process before, really. Like, well, at least when it comes to like its own arsenal, right? Like it's engaged in like non-proliferation stuff, but that's different, right? So so it's very different than countries like the US or countries like Russia, or, you know, other countries where there's kind of this a little bit more of a tradition of being willing to share information about your nuclear arsenal with other countries, because you need that for arms control. China's never done that, right? So I wonder, and I would hope that the, you know, other countries are thinking about how to engage with China on like these like baby steps, right? Like just thinking about, you know, considering what information they might be able to swap with China about their nuclear arsenals, like what things would be amenable to them, amenable to the Chinese leadership. Even things like agreeing on terms, right? Definitions of things. Is like how you eventually get to a treaty process, right? Like you know, there was this whole thing during the Trump administration about like bringing China into New START, right? Like there was no chance of that ever happening for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that like there's been no there haven't been like the years of engagement that need to happen in order for something like that to happen, right? Like it took you know, it took many years for the US and the Soviet Union to even get to the point where they were ready to sit down and negotiate properly about like a treaty framework. And there was a lot of stuff that happened behind the scenes before then about, you know, definitions, frameworks, you know, just kind of teasing things out between each other and learning what each country was willing to give up, and, you know, how they define things. There hasn't been any of that work with China. So like I would hope that these countries like in Europe, the United States, Russia, you know, are thinking about how to engage China on some of those kind of like very initial steps. I guess one way of doing that, and this is also kind of a frustrating thing like in the United States, is that you know, the previous opportunities for lights. All right. Previous opportunities for like academic exchanges, right, and like research opportunities between the US and China Like those used to be there, and now because of the political situation, you know, those opportunities, many of them don't really exist anymore. And so like we're really losing, or at least in the United States, the US is losing its ability to kind of interact with Chinese diplomats or researchers, academics on these issues. And so I wonder if maybe other countries can play a role there, if like those kinds of exchanges still exist in, you know, countries like France or the UK or something. I don't know if they do, but if they do, it would be interesting to see if perhaps they would be able to engage China, so that eventually there can be some kind of arms control framework that, you know, gets like passed through the United States, if that makes sense. Yeah.
But how much do you think the NPT can play a role in that? Because China is directly violating one of the 3 pillars, right? It's proliferating. So do you think there's anything the NPT can do and that China will be willing to acquiesce to?
Well, China, I guess, has like typically preferred to work in the more like international context rather than on a bilateral basis. So like perhaps there's a role there. It's interesting, I don't know the extent to which the NPT could work as like a forum for engaging China on some of these things. Like maybe it would make sense, right, to think about you know, setting maybe initial conversations about transparency between all you know, the P5 or something like that. Like I think that would be incredibly valuable, especially because honestly the US and the UK need some refreshers on transparency as well, because both of them are backsliding, right? Like both of those countries were previously very transparent about their nuclear forces, and then the UK, you know, the UK in particular, last year announced that they were no longer going to be transparent about any of their deployments or stockpile or anything like that. And I think that was a really poor decision. But you know, so honestly, I think some conversations about transparency would be very welcome in the NPT forum.
Yeah, exactly. And China's failure to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, how do you view that overall?
It's a good question. Well, I guess like when it comes to the CTBT, like I guess it's clear that there are also ways for countries to engage in the CTBT process and architecture without necessarily signing and ratifying, right? Like the United States has been a useful partner to the CTBT, you know, in terms of or the CTBTO rather, like in terms of some of the monitoring work that gets done, and like the like all of the different stations and things that are around the world. So, you know, it would be, to be honest, like I'm not super caught up on like how China is how engaged they are in that process. Like I know the US is and they haven't ratified, but I'm not sure if China is or not. So it would be an interesting thing to think about. But
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it's just another element that shows that China isn't that willing to yield to treaties and to international deals. But one thing we haven't mentioned, which is also very important, we have talked about China's buildup, but we haven't talked about the nature of these weapons. And you yourself, together with Professor Christensen, discovered these silos in Xinjiang. How technologically advanced would you say they are? Can they compare to those of the US and Russia? Because that's also an important question.
Oh, great question. Yeah, so we were involved in one of the discoveries, and like others were made at the James Martin Center, and then Kazi as well. And it's really interesting. Like we're tracking them pretty closely. You know, they're building extremely quickly. You know, almost you can go look at the imagery on a pretty much a daily basis and see that things are changing very rapidly. There's a lot of active construction going on. I guess we'll sort of we'll see, right? It sort of depends on what eventually gets deployed there. I would say that you know, it'll probably be, at least the U.S. assessment is that it'll be, you know, probably the DF-41, perhaps some DF-31s will be deployed in there. Like these are very capable ICBMs. You know, they have been tested a number of times. They seem to function well. I guess the difference between them is that they will almost certainly, or actually no, they will likely be deployed with multiple reentry vehicles. So the assessment from the US is that the DF-41, I think, will have 3 warheads deployed on it. In the United States, the US has a policy at the moment of only deploying a single warhead on each of its ICBMs. That could change, right? The US certainly has the capability of deploying more than 1 warhead on many of its ICBMs, and with the new Sentinel ICBM that's coming in, they could also deploy more than 1. And so in that sense, like I think they would be quite equivalent. But I guess we'll see. Like that's really the one major difference at the moment.
Hopefully we won't see.
Yeah, I guess hopefully not. Yeah.
So we don't have much time left, so we would like to quickly go over the regional repercussions of China's rapid armament. There's a few regional actors which we would like to ask you about that. Maybe you'd like to start, Alison?
Maybe about India, the rivalry and what's going on currently with India. Do we think that it could be this armament, while it probably has many reasons, do you think India is a factor kind of exerting that regional stronghold and dominance, if you will?
Yeah. So I definitely think that there's that India does play a role in Chinese thinking about you know, nuclear multipolarity at the moment, right? We're seeing actually, like literally right now, like there's currently Chinese troops and Indian troops are currently in conflict with each other, like hitting each other with big sticks. And you know, we've seen I believe during like an earlier skirmish, I think it was a year or 2 ago, I believe people did actually die as part of border skirmishes, if I'm remembering correctly. So like, you know, these are like, it's quite a serious situation there, and certainly one that, you know, you can imagine has the possibility of escalation in the future. You know, I would say thankfully, like we're not there right now, and you know, that's a good thing. But you know, I think there's a reason why a lot of analysts look at the situation in South Asia and they say like this is the most dangerous area in the world when it comes to nuclear weapons, because you have these questions with India and Pakistan and India and China and right, and then so there's all sorts of ways that things could spiral out of control, and India's nuclear arsenal is also, you know, going through a pretty interesting modernization right now, where they are increasingly posturing themselves to be able to launch very quickly in a crisis. And I think, like, generally speaking, this is probably oriented for the most part against Pakistan, not against China. But at the same time, like, India literally just yesterday tested a new missile, right, the Agni 5, which is has a range to be able to reach Beijing, right? And it didn't need that type of missile from Pakistan, right? It already had the abilities to cover all of Pakistan. So you know, clearly India is thinking about China, and China's probably thinking about India as well.
Hopefully it won't be used, actually. Perhaps both China and India are building up as sort of a leverage in negotiations about the disputed territories and whatnot. You can only hope that. But in the interest of time, since we only have 5 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken, we'd like to ask you about the elephant in the room today, and that is the war in Ukraine. So do you think China is even playing a role in the war of any kind? And if it is, how does its nuclear armament tie into it?
That's a great question, and one that I have not really considered very much. Well, I guess it's it's certainly not an active party in the conflict, which is good. But I would imagine it's watching pretty closely how Russia is thinking about nuclear signaling at the very least, because that is something that we've seen that's been quite interesting and quite unprecedented, at least for some time, is how much nuclear signaling has been going on in the course of an active conflict. And so, we've seen all of these different measures, whether it's been, Putin announcing, that there's going to be like a special status for certain types of deterrence forces, and then like people not really understanding what that means. Perhaps he didn't understand what it meant. I don't know. And just doing these kind of press releases where he's like reminding countries about his nuclear forces, and and then making actually like some quite explicit threats in certain cases. So I would imagine that China is probably watching that pretty closely and getting a sense of which types of signaling might be effective, which ones might not be. And I would imagine it's China's learning things just like we're all learning things about deterrence through this conflict. And so perhaps it's sort of absorbing some of those lessons. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's a good one. I haven't really put that much thought into it, so I have to think about it more.
Yeah, it's a very new topic, and hopefully we'll see it end pretty soon. But some commentators, our scholars, were mentioning that perhaps China would like to discourage Russia from using its nuclear arsenal in Ukraine, just because, well, China would much rather have a world at peace so it can trade and it can develop its economy, because that's probably its main goal. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, I think that no country benefits from actual nuclear war, but every country, I would say, benefits from almost nuclear war, if that makes sense. At least all of the nuclear-armed countries benefit from almost nuclear war, because it provides a lot of incentives, and mostly political and financial incentives for them to continue modernization and things like that, and all these things that they wanted to do anyways, right? And so it's like sometimes these kinds of threats and conflicts can be useful for countries who want to build up their nuclear forces in certain ways, but need to get their populations on side. They need to, need a justification for spending lots of money on things that they might not necessarily need. And so, typically these kinds of threatening conflicts can actually be quite useful for many countries. And sometimes we'll see, especially like when you think about like India and Pakistan, like they can ratchet up the rhetoric, whenever they need to, and it's often for domestic reasons, right? And it relates to their nuclear forces. So, yeah, in that sense, I would say countries tend to benefit from like almost nuclear war, like a nuclear escalation, but not like actual nuclear weapons being used. Like no one benefits from that. Everyone loses if that's the case. And I think China understands that as well. And so I would say that they probably would very much discourage any kind of actual nuclear use. But just like I think probably just like every country, they probably don't mind the signaling because it can often provide useful justifications for things.
That's a good point. Well, thank you. I think that's all the questions we had for today. I'm just going to stop recording.